Hi, World History students. It's me, Mr. Sunday again. Time for another lesson in world history. Last time we were together, we talked about the French Revolution and how King Louis XVI and his beautiful wife, Marie Antoinette, the Queen, lost their heads. And a bunch of other French people lost their heads too. While this whole revolution is going on, there's a young man who's kind of rising through the ranks in France. His name is Napoleon Bonaparte, one of the most dynamic individuals who ever walked on the face of the earth. And we have to go back to his humble beginnings. He is a Frenchman, kind of. He wasn't born in France. He was born in this island south of France in the Tyrrhenian Sea. It's called Corsica. Now, Corsica throughout history has been controlled by a whole bunch of different empires throughout history. And at the time that he was born, it had just recently been acquired by the French kingdom. And so he was born technically in France. His father was a middle-class lawyer who had a pretty good job and was making a little bit of money. And he wanted his boy to grow up to be a very successful guy. So he sent Napoleon to military school up near Paris. Now, when Napoleon got to military school, he was a young boy. He was probably about 10 years old, and he didn't have a whole lot of things in his favor. First off, most of the boys who went to that school were from noble families, and they were pretty wealthy. And here comes this boy who's wearing clothes that aren't quite as nice as theirs. They kind of made fun of him. He also didn't have the same kind of French accent that they had. He was like a hick from the sticks, and so he got made fun of because he had this funny accent. Also, he was physically kind of short. So, you know how bullies are. They always pick on the littler people. Napoleon had a few rough years in military school. But to make good use of his time, he dove into his studies, and he was a very adept student when it came to learning about the military. And as he grew older and older, he was infatuated with a modern weapon that had only been around for a short while. It was called the cannon. And as he grew up, he decided the cannon could be used more than just as a bombarding weapon against cities and fortresses. He wanted to design a cannon that had bigger wheels that his men could move around quickly on the battlefield and keep harassing the enemy constantly through the battle, instead of just doing a volley of cannon fire and then that was be the end of that of the artillery's part of the battle. He really revolutionized how to work with a cannon crew. There was a crew usually of about 5 guys. A corporal would command the guys to load it and swab it and keep it firing. And he was really, really adept at this. Now, Napoleon was born in 1769. So when the French Revolution broke out, it was 1789. So he is 20 years old, and he is fresh out of military school. He's a young lieutenant, and he decides he wants to fight on the side of the revolutionaries against the King and Queen of France. Now, if you remember from my last lecture, as soon as France decided they weren't going to be a kingdom anymore, or monarchy, they were going to be a republic, all of the surrounding countries declared war on France. Spain did, Portugal did, Great Britain did, Prussia did, Austria did. They were really in trouble. So now here's this young, enthusiastic artillery officer, and he has plenty of opportunities with plenty of battles to show how skilled he was as a soldier. And he started winning battle after battle after battle, pushing back all of these enemies that were trying to surround France. By the time Napoleon was 24 years old, he was a general in the French army. Now, Napoleon became kind of like a rock star in France. Everyone knew who he was. He was the winning guy. Everybody really was kind of in love with this romantic figure. He was a handsome young man. Even though he wasn't super duper tall, there are lots of discussions as to how tall Napoleon actually was. I'm not quite sure. Some people say he's 5'2", 5'4". I tend to think he was about 5'6", 5'7", which on today's standards is kind of short. Regardless, he was a hero, and he was winning battle after battle after battle. In the meantime, the French government, this new republic, was trying to run the country. Now, you got to remember that France had never been a republic before. And in a monarchy, it's easy to make decisions. The king just says, do this, and everyone does it. But in a republic, you have to vote. You have to listen to everyone's arguments. You have to see what the legislature wants to do. Things don't move that quickly. And Napoleon gets a little impatient with this government. And so he goes to Paris with some of his army, and he goes into the directory, that's the executive branch, and he says, you guys are not moving fast enough. This was in 1799, and he said, you know what? I'm taking over. And all these government guys, well, who says you get to take over? He says, well, I do, and all my soldiers outside are on my side too. They think that I would make a better leader than you guys. This is known as a coup d'etat. It means a strike at the state. And that's what he did. No lives were lost. They just basically threw up their hands and said, okay, you've got the guys. All right, you can run the country. But Napoleon didn't want to look like a dictator. He didn't want to look like he was becoming a king himself. He decided that he would make himself an executive officer in the government. He called himself the first consul of the first consul of France. And that expression comes back from the ancient Roman Empire. The consul was the executive officer in the government, and so now he is the executive officer of France. Now, if you remember correctly, the Roman consuls only served for 1 year term, and Napoleon did that. And after his year was up, he decided, you know what? Let's let the French people decide. I will have an election, and we'll see if I get voted back in. Well, guess what happened? Of course he did. Everyone in France loves Napoleon, so he was voted consul again. And after he was served another year, and he was reelected, he decided, you know what? Let's just not waste time. Let's have a special election where I will run for consul for the rest of my life. I will be your president for the rest of my life. Now, if the French people don't like that, they can vote against it. But guess what happened? The French people voted him to be consul for life. So now the French people are kind of stupid. They gave up a king and a queen. They fought a revolution. And now they're basically putting a military dictator in charge of their country. Now this might seem like a bad idea to have a dictator, but it just so happens Napoleon's pretty good at running a country. The first thing he does is he stabilizes their economy. Then he makes taxation equal across the board. It wasn't just the peasants who were being taxed anymore. Everybody kind of pitched in, and they were fair taxes. He also, to put some money into his treasury, he sold something to the United States of America. It was called Louisiana. Only it wasn't just the state of Louisiana. It was the Louisiana Purchase, which stretched from 1 million square acres across the country. It was an amazing thing for the United States to acquire. But Napoleon, it was great for him to get it off his hands, and he got some more money in his treasury. Now, during the French Revolution, most of the revolutionary people did not like the Catholic Church because that was associated with the king and queen all the time. They were Catholics, and the church was always supporting the monarchs. Well, so during the Revolution, the revolutionary French people didn't like the Catholic Church. But now that Napoleon's in power, he decided, you know what? We're going to have total toleration of any religion in this country, in my France, and that means we're going to make peace with the Pope in Rome and have Catholics free to worship if they choose to also. So he also decided, I'm going to appoint very competent people into my government offices, people who can really do the job well. So even if you had no nobility in your blood or anything like that, you could work your way up the ladder and have a good, important government job if you were good at the job. He was a very fair man. But one of my favorite things about Napoleon is he decided he did not want to be the leader of an ignorant country. Most totalitarian kings or dictators or rulers who want all the power, they don't care if their population is well educated. But Napoleon felt the other way. He said, I want to have a country filled with educated people. So he was one of the first people to actually have public education. Kids could go to school, and it's paid by the government. But the biggest accomplishment of Napoleon was how great of a military conquering general he was. He didn't just fight off all the armies that were invading France. He took his show on the road and started conquering other places. So France is here in the orange, but everything that's kind of a light orange or a pink colored was conquered by Napoleon. These green countries, Austria and Prussia and Denmark and Norway, they couldn't beat him, so they made alliances with him because they were afraid of him. They're like, we can't fight him anymore because we just can't beat him. So let's stay on his side. And so basically everything on the map, Napoleon was in control of, with the exception of Great Britain and Portugal and Sweden. He was basically in control of most of Europe at that time. And he decided it's no longer the country of France, the Republic of France. We have a French Empire. So he decided, I should be an emperor. I need a new title. But he didn't just do it. He actually had a vote in France. All the French people got to come up and vote if they wanted him to become the emperor of France. And guess what happened? Of course they did. They voted him to become emperor of France. And so he had a great big ceremony for him being crowned as emperor. He had the Pope himself come to put the crown on his head, and everybody's all dressed up, and he comes walking with his great big flowing robe behind him, and he walks up the aisle, and he climbs the steps up to the Pope, and the Pope stands up, and Napoleon's kneeling on the floor, and he's about ready to put the crown on Napoleon's head, and Napoleon jumps up and snatches the crown from the Pope and turns around. He says, I crown myself emperor, and he put the crown on his head. And then he took the other crown and turned to his wife, Josephine, who was kneeling, and crowned her the Empress of France. Now, Napoleon's life is so interesting. I can't get this all in one lesson. So I'm going to stop there today, and we'll see what happens to Napoleon in our next lesson. We'll see you soon.